don't think I've ever been up here at 10 past 11. But yeah, does that mean I preach longer now? I didn't get a real resounding yes, so maybe I won't. Today we're going to look at what is true worship. What is true worship? You see there a picture on the screen of, I don't know how many people, you could probably guess at how many people there are meeting in the one place, but it's a huge amount of people. And with the easing of the restrictions, we are still restricted to 2 square metres and other things in this church. But I discovered that when reading through the different things that were allowed, I noticed that every seat in a stadium can be filled now. And a lot of people ask me the question, why no restrictions there and yet still restrictions here? Tell me, who's confused by that? Put up your hand. That's most of us. Well, my answer to that is simply, that is what we worship. Sporting events, concerts, and all those sort of things is actually our worship. Who would agree with that? Yeah. So we want to protect our worship, don't we? So we protect those sort of things over church things. And that's really sad, because we're actually supposed to be a Christian nation, but we show by the things that we do that we're not actually Christian. That we're actually very secular people who their worship is a lot of other things other than what we class as worship here today. So we're going to look at that question, what is true worship? What does worship entail, and what drives our worship? Because I think really that is the question behind the question of worship, is what drives our worship? You know, when I was younger, I worshipped a number of things. Food was among them, but I've been doing a lot of fasting lately, so I'm trying not to think about that at the moment. But money was something that I worshipped. You know, I had a grandfather, and he was actually a godly man, but he also showed me the importance of money, and that if you don't have it, your life can be very, very difficult. And so he encouraged me to save. And I remember all my mates when we were young were buying cars and hotting up their cars and doing all these amazing things, while I had bought myself an old HT Holden that I'd paid $200 for. The guy that sold it to me was moving to WA, and he didn't think that this car would make the trip to WA. It was quite old, he thought, and he's probably not going to make it. Well, let me tell you, I thrashed that car for many years and hardly had a thing go wrong with it. And then not only did I buy it for $200, I sold it for $800. And so I was thinking to myself, that's pretty good. Because money was very important to me in those days, and I'd made a bit of money on that. You know, if I actually held onto that car now, it's probably worth about $30,000 or $40,000. But anyway, we took in garage costs and things like that. I've just got to forget about the past. But what I would do is I wouldn't spend any money on my cars. I wouldn't spend any money on anything. I would just want to save it. And when I went up to see my grandfather, I used to see him about once or twice a week. And he would come up with a question. He'd say, how much you got saved now? And I'd tell him how much I got saved. And he was so proud of me. He made me still feel so good about myself that I strived even harder to save more money. And as the money went up, I'd say, I've got 15,000 now, I've got this amount now, and I've got that amount. And every time he would go back and he would show that he was so proud of me for what I was doing. You know, when I look back at that situation, it wasn't the love of money that I was worshipping. It was the love of self, adoration from my grandfather that I was worshipping. Interesting thought, isn't it? And so today when we look at this worship and what it is, I first decided to go to the internet. So I went to the internet, found out Wikipedia, and Wikipedia said that worship is an act of religious devotion, usually, and I've put it in parenthesis there, usually directed towards a deity. Usually. For many, worship is not about an emotion. Now that's interesting. It says that worship is not about an emotion, because I'm going to show you some pictures a little bit later on where I think emotion is the driving force for that worship. Worship is not about emotion, it is more about recognition of God. So here is everything is pointing to God, isn't it? An act of worship may be performed individually, an informal or formal group. Such acts may involve honouring. It says there may involve honouring. I want to suggest to you the biblical model is a little bit different to that. But what about the dictionary? The dictionary says worship, the reverent love and devotion accorded to a deity, an idol, or a sacred object. So now we're adding a few things extra other than God. The ceremonies, prayers, or other religious forms by which this love is expressed. You know, I actually love, I remember preaching a sermon on worship many years ago in Casino. And ever since, I've really enjoyed asking people, what do they believe worship is? And it will actually blow you away the amount of different responses I get. I'm going to share some of those a little bit later on as well. But the third point here in the dictionary brought out is ardent admiration or love, admission, the worship of celebrities. So we find that people can also be worshipped, and we find probably that's where our greatest amount of worship actually comes into being in this place. And I'll talk about that shortly as well. Acts of worship in the dictionary there, to show profound religious devotion and respect to. It doesn't tell you who, but just says that. To be devoted to and full of admiration for. Show expression, feelings, or profound adoration through acts of worship like writs, prayers, singings, and witnessing. And it's interesting because when I ask people what they believe worship is, so many people will say it's praying, it's singing. And they see COVID as an actual restriction on their worship. Now I want to suggest, yes, it is a restriction, but it shouldn't be a restriction on your worship. Because worship is not just an outward thing. It's something that comes from within. And so there's many ways to express that, and we'll talk about that as well. These things I'm just saying to open up your thoughts in your minds about what worship is. All right. Can you see that? What's happening here? I want to suggest what is happening here is a form of worship. Is a form of worship. The people are actually crowded in here very thick to see a fellow who doesn't exist anymore, whose name is Michael Jackson. Why do people worship him? What did he give to the people? And did he really care about the people that he was in concert with? The people actually paid a lot of money to come to his concerts. But certainly doesn't appear that Michael Jackson gave them anything. And what's more, he doesn't even exist anymore. But we see the reaction of the crowd to those sort of things. Is that true worship? Who thinks that's true worship? I'm glad you're not game to put up your hand. So what is worship? Well, maybe we need to go to a church scene to discover what true worship is. Who reckons we need to go to a church scene to try and find out what true worship is? Let's have a look. Myrtle told me she was woken in the night well, not so much in the night for many of us, but for some of us at 9:30, and she couldn't go back to sleep. And she said, I might fall asleep today. I said, well, when I talk to you about what I'm sharing today, you might not want to fall asleep. What about the back pew? I can't see right at the back there. Is this what resembles what's happening up the back, up the top? Few people shaking their heads. Is this true worship? I'm glad Lismore's like that. Aren't you glad Lismore's not like that? All right, so what is true worship? Why do we actually come to church? Because most people will say we come to church to worship. We come to church to worship. And here's some of the reasons I've heard over my time of coming to church. One, because I like catching up with my friends. So you come to church to catch up with friends because you like the music. And wasn't the music beautiful this morning? That was a sleepy Because I like listening to the speaker. Oh, very good. Very good. Notice I didn't have that first, so I could get that reaction out of you. Because it's the right thing to do. Many of our people come because they know it's the right thing to do. I should actually go to church today. I haven't been for a while, I better go to church. It's the right thing to do. Because it fills in the time. I've actually heard that. Well, Sabbath's a long day, you can't do this, you can't do that, and well, it fills in a bit of time, so I'll come along to church for that reason. Some to appease the pastor. I actually have some people say, oh, sorry, I couldn't get to church this week, Pastor. I really wanted to be there and to listen to you. And I think, it's not about appeasing me. To feel better about myself. To appease my parents. Certainly when I was younger, I would come to church purely and simply because of my parents. I remember my parents saying to me, I think I was probably around about 14 or 15, and even 16. My parents said, you know what? It's now your choice as whether you come to church or not. And part of me inside was going, yes, I don't have to come anymore. It's up to me. But guess what? I was never bold enough to make that decision not to come. Because I knew how disappointed they would be. I knew how upset they'd be. And I'd probably cop 1,000 questions afterwards. So I would come because of my parents. Another one that I can really resound with is to stop my wife from nagging me. Many, many years ago, you've heard how I used to sit out in the car when I used to bring the family to this church. Because I didn't enjoy church. I didn't have a good experience. And so I would actually come, and I reluctantly come in and sit in church for that hour period of time, and as soon as it was over, I'd straight back out and into my car. But it stopped my wife from nagging me because she wanted what she had and wanted me to have what I had, but I didn't enjoy the worship experience. Why didn't I enjoy the worship experience? I don't know if you've noticed anything about all these things here, but all these things are associated with self. Everything that I've mentioned so far about why we come to church is about self. Even here, the next one, it says to hear a message that might inspire me. It's good that you want to be inspired, but you're coming for yourself. To be moved by the music. Music does move. I was listening to some music on the way in and I just thought, man, that is beautiful. And it does move us in different ways. But everything is not about, in this list that I've shown you, is not about worshipping God, is it? Does anyone not agree with that? This is not about worshipping God. This is actually about worshipping self. This is about worshipping self. So what is true worship? What is true worship? Worship is mentioned over 500 times in the Bible. Worship is mentioned many times, and many times it's actually talked about, and then they bowed their knee or they devoted themselves and they prostrated themselves before God and worshipped. So worship is about elevating and de-elevating. Worship is declaring the greatness of God in word and action. It actually involves, we're going to find out, it actually involves action today. It is an act of putting self aside to elevate God. Worship is bowing down to lift up. The act of worship is about anything that honours God. And I think Romans 12 verse 1 puts it very beautifully when it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice." Now all we hear sometimes in that is offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. And we miss the very first part of that text, which is in light of God's mercy. In light of what God has already done for me. So it's a reciprocal thing. And certainly the verses that go before Romans 12 verse 1 point to the greatness of God. So in light of that, and it tells us, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your true and proper worship. In other words, this is telling us that it's a heart response. It's a heart response to something that has already happened beforehand. And I want to look at two passages this morning. One in Isaiah chapter 6, which you've studied in your lesson. We want to look at it in a different way. And also we're going to look at John chapter 4, which I preached on not that long ago, but in a different light. But we want to look at it in the respect of worship today, these two passages. One is from a prophet who was already doing God's work and to everybody else looked like he knew and had it all together. But I'm going to suggest that this passage reveals that maybe he didn't have it all together. The other passage we're going to look at is the woman at the well, who was basically a nobody, and certainly in the Jews' eyes, was basically an outcast. And because of her past, it wasn't real good. But both these two peoples had encounters with God, and I want to look at their reaction to those encounters. So let's turn over in our Bibles to Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 6, and I'm going to start in verse 1. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord on the throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Here we find Isaiah getting a picture, and he tells us what year it was, and I'm not going to go into that. There's so much more in that as well, but I want us to focus on what Isaiah was seeing. Isaiah was seeing a picture of God high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the sanctuary. He was on the throne. Where is God's throne room? This tells us God's throne room is the sanctuary. What does the sanctuary tell us? What does the sanctuary tell us? It's his throne room. Sorry? Yes. It is the gospel. It is salvation. It is the way that God rules. And how does he rule? He rules by giving of himself. This tells us that God is not a God like any other God that we can experience, a God not like any other king, a God like not any other ruler. He is a God that de-elevates himself to save his people. He's a God that gives of himself. And so here Isaiah sees this picture of what? Yes, a God that is high and lifted up, but also a merciful God. We see the kingdoms of this world, all they want to do is elevate themselves and be high and lifted up, but God is up there and they're not. And certainly we see above it stood seraphim, Each one had 6 wings. 2 he covered his feet, 2 his face, 2 he covered his feet, 2 he flew. And one cried to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Another word for holy means moral perfection. What Isaiah was getting a picture of here is someone who was morally perfect in every single way. There's not one blemish against him. He is high and lifted up, and yet he is a merciful, loving God at the same time. And we see the worship here from these beings saying, Holy, holy, holy. We get this same picture in Revelation when we see that the Lamb comes up and sits with God on the throne. He is the slain Lamb that just redeemed us. And we find the worship holy, holy, holy. Ever thought of why 3 times? Always 3 times? There's 3 parts to the Godhead. And they are all holy beings. Holy, holy, holy. So here he's getting this amazing picture, this amazing vision. And verse 5 tells us what was his reaction to this amazing vision. He says, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. When Isaiah got this amazing picture of what God was really like, he started to realise his deficiencies. Did he realise his deficiencies before this? I'm going to suggest that maybe he didn't, because if we go back, let's go back to Isaiah chapter 3. And I'll pick out a few verses between chapter 3 and this where he gets this vision. Chapter 3 and verse 9 says, The look on their countenance witnessed against them, and they declared their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. So to this group of people he's saying, Woe to you, woe to you. In verse 11 he says, Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill for them, for the reward of his hands shall be given him. Verse 8 in chapter 5, let's go over to chapter 5 and verse 8. It says there, Woe to those who join house to house and add field to field till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. In my hearing, so basically here he's looking at people that are just creating empires for themselves. And he says, Woe to you who do this. Verse 11, Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may follow intoxicating drink and continue until night, till wine inflames them. The harp of the strings, the tambourines, the flutes, the wine are in their feast. But they do not regard the work of the Lord, nor consider the operation of his hands. Woe to you people, woe to this, woe to that, woe to them. These first few chapters is filled by woes to everybody else. In verse 20, it goes on, Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. Verse 21, Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. Man, there's a lot of people that are wise in their own eyes, aren't there, today? Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to valiant men of intoxicating drink. Woe, 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 woe to everybody else. And then he gets a picture of God, and what does he say? Woe. Woe to me. Woe to me. Now I believe prophets, pastors, elders and other people are actually held to a higher account because they have so much more knowledge. And so I certainly feel with Isaiah here when I look up and I condemn the people. I hope I don't condemn the people. But here he's getting a picture of a holy God, a majestic holy God, and he realises that he's finished. Verse 6 tells us, Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal which he had taken from the tongs of the altar. And he touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, your sin is purged. Wow. Wow. What now is he getting a picture of? He's getting a picture of a merciful, loving God. He's giving a picture not of how great he is, but how merciful he is now. And in the next verse it tells us, I also heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? So here the Lord's visiting Isaiah, and he has this question, whom will I send, whom will go for us? You know, if I was asked that in my position, I would say, well, what about Michelle? She's so good at this. What about Isaac? What about Brad? Man, he's great with the young people. What about Dwayne? What about Noel? What about sending this person, that person? Isaiah knows a lot of people. He could have come up with a lot of names here. But what does he say? Then I said, here am I, send me. Now, was this the call to Isaiah's ministry? He had actually been in ministry for around 15 years before this event. And when God visits him and gives him a vision of who he is, who does he want to go? Even though he had a fair amount of work on his plate, he goes, send me. I want to do this for you, Lord. Why? Because he's got a new picture of who God is. He's got a new picture. It began with a knowledge of who God is. It begins with an encounter of God. Isaiah had had an encounter with God. And it begins with a knowledge of his love, despite who Isaiah was. Despite the fact that he was a leader and he was condemning everybody else without realising he had fault in himself. Do people do that today? Everyone's looking away. Do people do that today? We're so good at finding fault in others, but when it comes to ourselves, we really struggle. But what Isaiah realised here, despite of who he was in the sight of a holy God, he was loved. And he goes, send me. So what comes out of this? What comes out of an encounter with God? What comes out of a truer picture of who God is? What comes out is actions. What comes out is he says, Lord, send me. Send me. That is true worship. I want us to go over to John chapter 4 now. And in John chapter 4, we're going to see a lady who knows little, really, not as much as what Isaiah knew, but had a checkered past. But she had an encounter with Jesus. And when she had an encounter with Jesus, we want to see her reaction as well. John chapter 4. And I'm not going to go over the whole of this story, but I want to start in verse 15. Before this, we find that Jesus had to go through Samaria. He'd come to Jacob's well. His disciples had all gone into town to buy food, and Jesus was left there, and a woman turns up. A Samaritan woman turns up, and Jesus has an encounter with her. Now, for the Samaritan woman, this Jew having a conversation with her was very uncomfortable for her, because Jews didn't speak to Samaritans, let alone males speaking to females. And so it was very uncomfortable for this lady. She couldn't understand why he would ask her for a drink. He was thirsty. And so Jesus turns the conversation around and he said, if you knew who I was, you would have asked me for the living water. This sort of intrigued her a little bit, and she wanted to know more about this living water. And in verse 15 she says, the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor have to come here to draw. And Jesus said to her, Go call your husband and come here. I want to suggest to you, then when she got this response, she was squirming in her seat. This was going to bring up her past. This was going to have to reveal everything. And how was I going to deal with this? Bring my husband? I don't have a husband. So she comes back and says, I don't have a husband. Let's get off that subject. I don't have a husband. Let's deal with something else. Let's go back to this living water stuff. I want to know about that. Let's not talk about my past. Because my past separates me from people. When people find out about who I am, they are turned off. You know, people don't share in church today. They don't share with people because they're afraid of when they share who they really are behind the facade that they put on, that people might reject them. Should that happen in church? We should be able to share our past, share what's really going on, share our struggles through the week. You know, I have some people that come to me and says, yeah, I got caught up in having a drink again. I got onto the cigarettes again, and I'm thinking, wow, how is it that they share that with me? And when I look, I realise that they don't see condemnation in me. They are actually reaching out for help. And I think, wow, that's great. I'm glad God is allowing that to happen. Because, you know, when the pastor ever saw me when I was younger, he said, how are you going in your spiritual walk? I go, yeah, great, everything's good. Yeah, no problem at all. In other words, leave me alone, I don't want to talk about it. But a lot of people don't talk about where they're at, what's going on in their life, because they're fearful of how that person is going to now see them. Because we are a judgmental people. Well, not Lismore people, sorry, but in general, people are a judgmental people. And so she says, I've got no husband, let's move on. And Jesus says, for you have had 5 husbands. You have well said. He says, you have well said, I have no husbands, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you are with now is not your husband. Now, is Jesus condemning here? There's no condemnation in this, because he's actually just revealing to her that he knows about her past. The beautiful thing that I haven't seen in this passage before is that Jesus is actually saying, I know about your past. I know about what has happened and the decisions that you have made and what's led to you being where you are, but I don't judge that. I still want relationship with you. Isn't that beautiful? In the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve had sinned and caused everything that we see here happening on this earth, Adam and Eve were hiding, and God comes looking. He's saying, you have well said. He's actually affirming her for what she has said. He's actually affirming her that she's been able to say that. And he's saying, I know about your past. I know about your past, and I still want to have a relationship with you. She's still uncomfortable, I believe. So she tries to change the subject. And she wants to know about worship. In verse 19 it says, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. The Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place to worship. Where ought one worship? In other words, she wanted to address this deep theological question of the day. What is worship? Where is worship meant to partake? And what is true worship? So is it here? Have we got it right, or have you got it right? You Jews got it right. Where should we be? Should we be in this place, or should we be in that place? Should we have 3 songs and then a prayer and then the service? Should we do this? Should we do that? What is the correct thing to do? What is true worship? It's interesting, Jesus' response. He said to the woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem worship the Father. In other words, you're missing the point on what worship is. You're making it about a place. And he says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. Now, was Jesus here trying to elevate the Jews above the Samaritans? No, that's not where he is going. Where he is going is to say that, hey, salvation comes through the line of the Jews. Whatever comes through that line, that's what you should be worshipping. because it is your salvation. And then he goes on to say, but the hour is coming and now is when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Lord is seeking such to worship him. The Lord is seeking such to worship him. So what does Jesus say about true worship? It is in spirit and in truth. In other words, it's a heart thing as well as a truth thing, in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The living water that he was trying to give this woman was the Holy Spirit that was going to well up inside her, that was going to change her, that was going to reorientate her life, was part of what true worship is. She needed to know the truth that salvation comes through the Jewish line, that the Messiah was coming. And the woman answered and said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Wow. She's had an encounter with God. Here she has had an encounter with God, and she's moved by this encounter, and we find that the disciples come along at this point, and then she runs back off into town. Why did she come out to the well? She came out to get water because she needed water, because that was the main focus of her life. But now she has had an encounter with God. The verse tells us that she left the water pot behind. She left the water pot behind. We find that true worship in this situation was an encounter with Jesus, about discovering the truth about who he was. It begins with an understanding of what he wants for you. It begins an understanding that you are special, despite your past. What brought me back to God when I was around 40 years of age was getting a truer picture of who God was. I had a picture of God that I had to be somebody for God to love me, and then I got an understanding that God loved me just as I am. Did he want me to stay in that position? No, he didn't want me to stay in that position. But he loves us just as we are, despite our past. And what comes out is true worship. What comes out is true worship. We find that this woman couldn't wait to get back into town to tell the men, hey, I've had an encounter with the Messiah. And he knows all about my past. He knows all about my past, and that didn't affect him coming to me. Wow. So here now she wanted to serve and bring others to Jesus. True worship will open us up. It will recalibrate our emotions. It expands our capacity to love. It is a heart or a spirit response. And it comes from not who we are by what we do, but who we are by who we are, by what God has made us. Our true identity in Christ is what should motivate us. You know, whenever you meet people today, one of the first conversation pieces is, so what do you do? What do you do? And I had a lot of trouble telling people I was just a plumber. Sorry, Tim. But call yourself a hydraulics consultant, because that sounds a lot better and people might really like you because of that. But if I met a neurosurgeon, man, I'd really not tell him that I was just a plumber. I was someone else. Otherwise, the conversation would stop there and I'd be discarded. He wouldn't want to talk to me. That's because in our world today, we are what we do rather than the other way around, how God actually puts it. So true worship. From these two passages we can see clearly that true worship stems from the process of daily time with God. By getting a greater picture of who he is. It's actually a science. True worship is actually a science, Tony. A science is what? A science is actually putting something out there and observing it and looking at it and working it out. And when we find out who God really is, that changes and reorientates our life. We'll get a truer and accurate picture of his character. The one thing that the devil's trying to do is to stop your time with God. Why? Because if he stops your time with God, then you will not get a true picture of who God is. If he stops your time with God, everything else will fill your life and you won't be able to have that true worship experience. Because true worship comes from a knowledge of who God is. And that needs to be done on a daily basis. Because the enemy is out there, he is attacking. You know, so many people don't want to know God today. Why don't they want to know God? Because they already have a picture of who God is. But I want to suggest to you that that's not the right picture. So what we can do is actually change their orientation, change their picture of who God is, to get them to see what we see. But we notice that in these passages, when they got a true and accurate picture of who God was, that it results in true spontaneous worship. It results in action, resulting in other-centered worship rather than self-centered worship. I thought I was worshipping money, but I was actually worshipping self. Everything that we either worship self or we worship God. And when our focus is on self, we're going to turn out to be ugly people. But when our focus is on God, we will be sons and daughters of God. I pray that this will inspire you to want to spend more time with God, to get a greater picture of who God is, and that you will be drawn closer to him through the coming weeks. I invite you to stand as we bow our heads. Dear Father in heaven, I want to thank you for who you really are. I pray, Lord, for everyone here, for everyone who is listening, that we will spend that time to get a greater picture of how great you really are. And may each of us be drawn to you. And may this drawing to you cause us into action, that we can return that worship through our actions. So be with each one of us as we go our separate way, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.